Good evening. Welcome to tonight's book talk on Latino USA, A Cartoon History. I'm Elizabeth Venditto for the Tenement Museum, and I am joined once again by Professor Ilan Stavans. Thank you for joining us this evening.
My pleasure, my joy.
And a brief biography, just to reintroduce you to our audience, because you joined us last October for another book talk on how Yiddish changed America and how America changed Yiddish. And as promised, we brought you back to talk about Spanglish. So before we get started, Professor Ilan Stavans is an internationally known, award-winning cultural critic, linguist, translator, public speaker, editor, short story writer, and TV host, and much more. Born in Mexico into a Jewish family with roots in Eastern Europe, he was raised in a multilingual environment, and we will talk a lot about language tonight. He is best known for his research on English, Spanish, Yiddish, Ladino, and in particular, Spanglish. So welcome to the program. I'm going to pull up one of the first images for our book, but to kick us off, this is a cartoon history. So what exactly is a cartoon history?
Let me start, Liz, by saying that I'm very happy to be back in a conversation with you. I enjoyed it last time. I'm looking forward to what you have in store in terms of questions and the engagements. I grew up in Mexico in the 70s, and it was a time of cultural fermentation where the border between highbrow and popular culture was being erased. And there were all sorts of educational, ideological, artistic strategies to bring in elements that belong to folklore, that belong to day-to-day Mexican life, like a piñata, like the Day of the Dead, like Frida Kahlo, the Virgin of Guadalupe, as icons in the nation psyche, in order to try to understand who we were as a nation and who we were also individually. So a cartoon history is an attempt many years later by the so-called grown-up that connects with that young man or child coming of age south of the border, that looks to explain what is Latino history, Latino, Latina, Latinx history, before the Latinx category or name came about, for as broad an audience as possible in my view, engaging and even thought-provoking a way as it can be achieved through the marriage between cartoons, many of them irreverent and kind of unexpected, in a narrative that wants to, within just less than 200 pages, tell you a broad, mural-like narrative that goes back to before 1492 to the present, mixing the scholarly with the more broad and popular. That was the dream behind the book.
I love that expression, mural-like, because that is what I took from the book, right? It's big, it's artistic, it's focused on imagery, but it also has those little nuances that make you engage for a long time up close and zoomed out. Yeah. And I hope we'll get an opportunity to do both of those things this evening. Why specifically tell Latino history, this history of Latinos in the USA in this format?
The book came out in the early 2000s. It was a moment in which the parallel national histories of Latinos, Puerto Ricans in the island, in the mainland, Mexicans north and south of the Rio Grande, Cubans who had left the island before, or particularly after 1958 and 59 with the Cuban Revolution, the Fidel Castro Revolution. Each of them had its own track, so to speak. And nationally, we talked about Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Dominican Americans, Colombian Americans. But in the 90s, in particular, there was the roots were back in the 80s, but in the 90s in particular, there was an attempt to see this as a monolithic, a cohesive group that was made of many parts, in and of itself, a kind of a pluribus unum, a reflection of the multiplicity that the country itself had, that wasn't always harmonious and symmetrical. Some parts were louder or more prominent or took more space or made people feel in a particular fashion vis-a-vis the others, but it was really a moment of consciousness, nationally and minority-wise. We were coming to terms with the power that we had at the voting booth, at the level of the capital that we represented, of buying merchandise and endorsing products, and also trying to see if the dream that had taken place in Latin America in the 19th century of creating a unified Simon Bolivar-like view that all of Latin America was one big symphony of voices, if the same thing happened in the United States. And so the effort in this book was, on the one hand, to play with the most kind of attractive elements of cartoons and illustrations of the type that show up in political newspapers, like at that time, The Village Voice or The Advocate, and do so in a way that was not only, for a scholar like me, not only for students, but for readers in general, for as broad an audience as possible. And frankly, Liz, it was also a way for me to insert myself in that trend. I am, as you mentioned, an immigrant from Mexico. I came in my mid-20s, and I often ask myself, at what point did I stop being Mexican and became Latino, if it happened at one particular point? What is it that one needs to go through acculturation, transculturation, in order to feel that one is part of a minority on this side and less so of the place that one comes from? And the book tried to bring elements of the past, bring elements of popular culture in Mexico, but do it very much for the Latino population in the United States that, in my view then, and it is still now, needed to see its roots, it's being anchored in Latin American history.
And this book now is in its second edition, right? This is what we're selling in our shop. What we've been talking about tonight is the 15th anniversary edition, which has a new chapter that brings things from the late 90s to the present.
Yeah. So
in that period, what has the response been, and what's the audience the book has found?
The book has found an amazing audience, Liz. It's an audience, because the book has been out now 20 plus years. There were people that were, 15 years old when it came out, that now are in their mid-30s. And it has been able to go beyond and remain close to a new generation of Latinos that sees things different, that are children of the ones that are 35 right now. It feels very rewarding. It's happening to me too in the classroom, where I am having students that are the children of my students, and that makes you feel very old, but also gives you a sense of continuity. The idea of expanding, of making a new edition, it has gone through many printings. The new edition is the hope of bringing it up to date. You know, books like this are always trying to catch up, because the moment you publish it, there's something already happened. There was much that had taken place between the year 2000 and today. A Latina in the Supreme Court, all sorts of movements that had to do with immigration, the DREAM Act, the whole debate of those that are undocumented, that belong or don't belong, clearly belong, but is the resistance that this country is, the most conservative sectors have had toward them. And by and large, the the arrival to the middle class of the Latino minority, something that you can see on television, you can see in the way products are marketed, in the way books are distributed in movies, all this type of, oh wow, now we're at the center. Now we don't have a culture that is in the outskirts of the mainstream. Is something that has happened really as Latino history and as Latino culture in the last two decades, maybe 3 decades at the most.
What's so striking is even with the addition of that chapter, you're asking provocative questions throughout the book. What does the community look like? What does success look like? What is the future? What is a history to begin with? And those questions still remain all this time later.
Yeah, they remain because the big question is, if the questions no longer remain, are we still a community? And I put here comparisons with the Jewish American minority, or the Italian American minority, or the Asian American minority. At what point is the minority so incorporated, so part of mainstream culture, that it doesn't ask those questions because it doesn't see itself anymore as a separate entity that belongs to the larger group? I think that we are witnessing success, which means that many Latinos have entered American society in full. And in that process, they might be forgetting, as it often is the case, who they were, the history that they had, what their roots. And when they have children, they might be rethinking again how to present that history to the next generation. I think it happens with every group. Some groups move faster, others move slower. Not everybody has the same obstacles. But I think that there's always a moment of reckoning. Am I still a Latino or a Latina? If I am a Latina, what does it mean for me to be one? What do I share with others? In what way is my daughter and or granddaughter going to have questions that are different from mine? I think that those are crucial elements in the process of becoming Americans that have a hyphenated identity.
Would you use that term, hyphenated identity? I know it's a little, it's a complicated term.
Yeah.
Would you use term hyphenated identity here? Or for the type of history you're trying to tell? Is this a hyphenated history?
You know, the hyphen used to be very much in vogue in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the point then was, you are neither American nor Latino, but you live in the in-between. That in-between is a border. It's the impasse of the departure and the arrival, but neither of them having completely fulfilled their cycle, and you find yourself in the middle. It has gone out of fashion, the term hyphenated, but I think that we still use very much that semantic quality when we say African Americans or Asian Americans or Latinx Americans. We might not be emphasizing so much the hyphen as a symbol, but we still put the little dash in the middle, which means that we are seeing ourselves as composites, meaning there is something from us that comes from a minority, and there's something from us that is a majority. So it's African American, Asian American, Latino American. The American part always comes at the end and not at the beginning. We're not a American Black or American Latino. And when we are, then something dramatic has taken place. I remember a big debate that took place in the 70s when Saul Bellow won the Nobel Prize, 1976, and he won it as an American Jew. And 2 years later, Isaac Bashevis Sicker, who was also an American Jew, but he was an immigrant from Poland, a Yiddish speaker, very committed to writing in Yiddish, he won it as a Yiddish writer in America, or as a Jewish American, or a Yiddish-speaking American. So it's simply where people would put that first a noun or adjective would define their connection. I think that those issues of belonging are still with us. Maybe the fractured nature of American politics, of American society right now, that is the left very suspicious from the right, the Democrats from the Republicans, have pushed our attention out of identity politics. I would say happily so, at least for a vacation. But I don't think that this really ever disappears. It's just that it acquires a new vocabulary, and we will come up with new categories to refer to it.
And I do want to hold that because we will talk about vocabulary. First, before we continue, I want to invite our audience at any time to submit questions through the chat about anything we're talking about the images on your screen, or about the wider topics of the book. But also before we continue, I want to ask you about your collaborator on this book, because this is a co-creation, to talk a little bit about how you made this holistically.
Yeah, this is a collaboration with, as you can see from the image on the screen that shows up early in the book, Lalo Alcarez. Lalo is a very popular illustrator and political cartoonist who lives in California and has been very active. Lalo and I had crossed paths in the 90s. We admired each other's work. We sometimes talk about a possible collaboration, and we did something very small compared to a book. And at one point, I was invited by a New York publisher to consider the idea of doing a cartoon history of Latinos. And I immediately thought of Lalo. I think Lalo has a shrewd, sarcastic, irreverent sense of humor. And it was a fabulously creative relationship, the one we had. We worked together on this book for, I think in total, about 18 months. I first wrote a storyboard, sent it to Lalo. Lalo changed a few things. Then I began to sketch out every single one of the pages. And I would say 6 panels in this page. Panel 1 includes this information. This is what the characters say. Panel 2, panel 3, etc. Next page, only a single panel. Imagine a map, or imagine whatever, the conquest of the arrival to the Americas by Columbus. And I would send it to him. He would begin creating the images, send it back to me, back and forth. This is before email. So it was by fax, by FedEx, by anything that we could use. And I would say, Liz, that every single page that you see has, I don't know, 10 pages that are dead behind, that were sketches or that were discarded. There was a lot of compressing. There was a lot of, Ilan, I don't really like this. Can you change it? But if I change this, what we did 2 pages before also needs to be changed. It was and again, this is before some of the PDFs and the mechanisms that we have today that make this type of collaboration much more dynamic and organic. It was a headache. And of course, each of us had other things to do as well, aside from this. But it was incredibly rewarding, incredibly.
We can see the proof. I feel like this is a good time to introduce the work, and especially your characters, because you've conceived of this as a story, as a theatrical performance with many, many, many characters. I know we have limited time, but if you could talk to us about some of these characters and how you both work to create them and what their role is here.
For people who are looking at the screen, this is this purports to be a kind of playbill or a list of the different characters that will show up in the book. The whole, as Liz was saying, the whole book is imagined as if it was a performance. There is a curtain at the beginning that goes up and then comes down at the very end. There are different acts. Every so often, there's a curtain behind which the author or one of the characters shows up. And my deliberate attempt was to play with archetypes, prototypes, and stereotypes, mixing them all. I wanted to get my hands dirty And you could see, for instance, that there's a calavera, a skeleton, which is a very popular icon, a character of the Day of the Dead in Mexico, in the southwest, the southern part of the United States, but also in certain parts of Latin America. The toucan, a bird that has often been connected with a type of trite covers of Latin American novels that always have tropical elements, because a good magic realist novel has to have a prostitute, has to have a forgotten military figure, and some bird or butterfly that will show up. And I wanted to include one. Lalo is married to a teacher, and there is a maestra that shows up here. There's also the luchador, or the wrestler. There is Lalo himself. There is the publisher, as you can see from the bottom right, that is trying to capitalize on everything that we do. And just on the opposite side is Cantinflas, the most popular comic in the Hispanic world and a hero of mine. So these are all, there's piñatas and there's all sorts of flavorful images that show up throughout the book. And I wanted to very much go to the heart of how Latin America, Latinos are perceived. What is it that makes us, in the popular imagination, the characters that we are, and wanted to play with that in a way that would frankly provoke the reader to think broadly about how culture is built, in what way the heroes, the anti-heroes, the pantheon of icons that we all have, in particular minorities, represent us or are stolen from us, are taken away from us, and become part of a kind of corporate way of looking at things. And the book plays with some of that kind of corporate approach of, for instance, an image of the activist Cesar Chavez that shows up on a board that as an Apple commercial, or there's a McDonald's, there's Pepsi, and it's deliberately very, I would say, promiscuous in terms of where the images are coming from.
And you're a character. And you're a character who's always there. Not always getting along with the other characters. Do tell.
Yeah. And there's always the question, I think you'll sympathize or you'll antagonize this thought. There's always the question of what is the author's agenda? How is he presenting history? And what do the other characters think about that agenda? I put myself in there in a way that becomes the punching bag of others. Really, was it a conquest? Was it an encounter? Why are you stating one and not the other? Because in the end, what I wanted is to question how we present history, to wonder what is it behind the effort of telling ourselves a story of where we came from, that ultimately will hopefully lead us to some future that will be connected with it.
But we start about 500 years ago. And we start not even so much with the past, but with names. So to return the conversation we had earlier, you start with this conversation among the characters of what is this river called? It's a river of many names.
Right.
Why start here? Well, first, why start here?
The answer to this is because, to me, in the end, everything is about language. All the big problems of humankind can be either reduced or expanded to the very fact that we are articulating questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? And those are grammatical and syntactical questions. And when an immigrant arrives as Pearl, but she, in the process of going through Ellis Island, becomes Pauline, or somebody from Mexico starts as Pancho and arrives to become Marvin, there is a process of reinvention in the immigration process, in the translation of the culture from the country of origin to the United States, from Spanish in this case, or Portuguese, or Italian, or Yiddish, or French, or Russian, to the English that we are communicating with. And so to me, Latino history is the way we have the English language has adopted and co-opted the terms that have come from south of the border, from the Caribbean, from Spain, into a history that we can all digest. Why is it Montezuma and not Moctezuma? In Spanish, we have a C. In English, we have an N. Why is it that when you look at the very same river, from one side is the Rio Grande, from the other side is the Rio Bravo. Bravo means brave or courageous. Grande means big. And I think just the naming will tell you a lot about how that river is perceived. And to me, that's in and of itself a fascinating starting point to figure out what are the words that we're going to use to describe our history.
And also, what are the languages that you're using to tell this history? I mean, I'm looking at the top half of the two panels or three panels on top, and there's this mixture of language. How do you choose the language that you tell these stories in?
Yeah, this book is very different in its Spanish edition. That's because the Spanish language reader approaches the entire narrative of Latinos in the United States from a different perspective. In English, the English that Latinos used in 1930, 1950, 1970, 1990 to the present has changed. And I think one of the statements of assimilation is the amount of words that a particular group gifts to the English language, and they become a staple. And you can see a vast amount of Spanish words in today's edition of Merriam-Webster or the Oxford English Dictionary that go from tortilla to lasso to burrito, piñata, so on and so forth. The words that don't have, many of them, a translation, they are in English right now. They become part of the larger current. And to me, that is that we are kind of making our place, not only in the country, but in the language. The language itself needs to be more English, more elastic, more plastic, more malleable, in order to reflect this major minority presence that is Latinos in all their diversity and complexity, because Latinos themselves speak many languages, many forms of Spanish. The Spanish of Colombia is different from the Spanish of the Dominican Republic, of Panama, of Venezuela. And that means that we have to be very attuned to the nuances of the language.
So I have to follow up, because you said on one hand, assimilation triggers this process of bringing more words into English and an elasticity there, but you also talked about making a space.
Yeah.
Are either of those the story that you're telling throughout the book?
I see Latinos in the United States both as an extremity of Latin America, north of the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo. I am convinced that a new nation has emerged in the last 150 years, and that is a nation within the United States that are Latinos. We are not the largest, but the second largest concentration of Hispanic people anywhere in the world. We call ourselves Latinos, but there are more Latinos in the there are more Hispanics, that is, people from Hispanic background in the United States than Spaniards in Spain, or the Salvadorians in El Salvador, or certainly Cubans in Cuba. And I think that what we have seen is the emergence of a new nation, a new mestizo nation in this country. But at the same time, I think that we have witnessed the consolidation of a new minority in terms of political, economic, social, cultural power. And that minority is an ethnic group, is a cultural group, is a minority group, depending on how you want to approach it, that is and isn't part of Latin America anymore. It is very much part of this mosaic or melting pot that is the United States. So I deliberately in the book don't want to solve that question. I want to leave it open because I think there is no Latino history without Latin American history. There is no Latino history without American history, meaning US history. We are the convergence of the two.
And I want to ask you about the moments in which those two histories meet. So I took this from one of the beginning of the chapters. You've broken up the book. So this is 500 years of history in 200 pages, into 5 major sections. And I'm curious about these major eras in Latino and Latin American history that you've identified. What are they and how did you come to this? I know periodization is always, I'm a historian and we always ask about how do you organize history? Right. So why have you organized the book and the story in this way?
The question itself it carries the answer, or the skepticism throughout the answer is because any attempt at periodizing history it's always going to be contested. When we say, oh, the 60s were in this particular way, where does the 60s start? And where does the 60s end? Does it really end in 1969 or on January 1st or 1970? Can the 60s be said to prolong themselves until 1973 or 1974? There's a recent book about the 90s, and it argues that the 90s don't really end until 9/11. Where the world really was transformed. And so we use comfortable categories that relate to periods for the easy approach of generations or waves or certain fashions, states of mind. And because any attempt at doing a broad, sprawling, a multi-generational history is in of itself problematic, I thought that the best way would be to divide it in a fashion that people would be able to understand, but at the same time find provoking. So starting in 1492 makes a statement that before 1492 there were no Latinos, but that's not the case. It's just that 1492 has become such a decisive point in world history and in Hispanic history. It is the breaking of the waters. And it goes roughly, the first period goes roughly between that moment of Columbus's arrival to Hispaniola, where it's today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, to roughly the end of the age of independence. It's a very long period, but it's so long because when it comes, if I were doing a history of Latin America, I would never divide it this way. But nothing here is, if you divide it in small pieces, is as essential to understand Latinos in the US, other than the fact that in this particular moment, certain parts of Latin America, say in 1846, 48, there was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that sold a large portion of the Southwest to the United States, and that at the very end of the 19th century, the Spanish-American War also brought down the Spanish Empire, and Caribbean nation states like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic began to look at themselves differently. But from that moment on, from the first part, I go rather fast. The second part goes roughly until after the Second World War. The third part goes until the 70s. The following part is the 80s and 90s. And then the last part is really what has happened after 9/11 to the present. That allows us to see how Latinos have become willy-nilly a single heterogeneous group. This, once more and very quickly, are artificial divisions that historians use in order to be able to digest or to fragment history in ways that are narratively convenient. And I do so by justifying them within each of the sections of what were the major events that defined Latino history, and how were they different from what happened before and after.
I have to veer from this image because I did want to address or ask you about one of the things in the last chapter. So you're talking about major events that define Latino history. So in that final chapter, which was written since the book was originally published, I believe in 1998, you had some moments, some key moments in Latino history that I would have expected, like Dreamers organizing, particular restricted immigration laws. But I was also struck by how heavily the war on terror played in that section. Could you tell us more about how you view that period?
Yes, I view the period of 9/11 and up until, I would say, the 2010 as a period of fear for minorities. The concept that we are here as a nation vulnerable to attacks that come from the outside, and that we are being infiltrated. It started with the W. Bush. It didn't start, but it became the rhetoric of the Bush administration that was amplified to an incredibly destructive way during the Trump years, of the immigrant, the outsider, as a potential subversive force that will bring down our nation. And we have to very clearly define who is in and who is out. And we do so by building walls, by creating a rhetoric of fear, of be suspicious of Muslims, be suspicious of people crossing the border illegally, particularly from the south to the north, not so much from Canada. And I also think that that war on terror that obviously had Muslim Americans right at the heart of it spilled over to the whole debate of belonging and not belonging that defined who Latinos are, in what way we feel we connect to the military, we connect to social media, we connect to Hollywood. At what point could we say we have made it in and we're no longer the evil character that shows up in the next James Bond or superhero movie, always as the drug trafficker, the abuser, the one that is going to bring down. One of the most uncomfortable moments, that's way beyond that last chapter, the Trump years are beyond that last chapter, is when Trump started using terms like bad hombres, a term, by the way, that in Mexico we don't use bad hombre. And it became ubiquitous, and it defined just about everybody that was crossing the border. There was a terror that could be unfolded in different ways, as terror as in terrorist, and terror as my sense of who I am as an American is being threatened by the neighbors that are arriving now into my neighborhood, and that are not paying the same taxes, or want to take over a classroom, or want to take over the hospital bed, so on and so forth. Very intense rhetoric against immigrants.
And you leave those questions still open-ended at the end. There isn't a
absolutely open-ended. I mean, have we resolved it? This country, you are a historian of the immigration, and you are right there at the Tenement Museum, an institution that is essential to who we are as Americans, and now more than ever, the rhetoric we are in an impasse right now. We're distracted by the atrocities that are taking place in Europe at the moment, but the viciousness against immigrants keep on coming back in cyclical ways. And no longer is a group being the target when the next group becomes the fashionable target for the next attackers. It always seems as if this country opening its arms to those that are, the hungry and tired, running away from other countries, are also vilified the moment they arrive. And it comes with a big trauma of entering the middle class, not without all the travesty of having been ridiculed along the way.
So I'd also argue it's not a unique phenomenon to the United States. It's
Absolutely
something
not.
that happens everywhere. It's something we have exported very
Yes,
deliberately.
I was going to say
Political
that.
goals.
Because this is the oldest democracy, and sometimes it feels very fragile right now. And this is also one of the most consolidated experiments in world history connected with immigration. Many countries have followed us in terms of democratic values, and also in the sense of you can, particularly in the 21st century, not have immigrants in your country. The world, climate change, populism, all sorts of other factors push people, wars, push people out of their environment, and there will be outsiders coming in. You might have the mantra that your country depends on those outsiders, like we do with Emma Lazarus' famous sonnet in the plaque of the Statue of Liberty. But the other countries without that big mantra, they will also have that. And yes, you're totally right. It happens everywhere. But people still see the United States as the role model for better or worse. And when we stumble, others see us stumble. And when we are strong, others see our strength.
And on that, I would invite our audience to please contribute your comments and questions in the chat. These are important conversations we hope you will join us in. I'm going to shift gears slightly because I want to talk about some of those people that are at the heart of these conversations and of what it means to have a Latino history in the US. You've talked about how it's a history, the two histories that are entwined. There's Latin American history and Latino history in the United States. And so I took this selection from the book because I think it's a good example about how you're entwining both and how both pieces of the story are important to what you're working on here. So could you just talk us through this page a little bit?
Yes, this page is an attempt to using popular icons, in this case, a series of spies that became the staple of Mad Magazine, to show the degree to which dictatorship, tyranny, revolution, political upheaval in Latin America has brought immigrants to the United States in a consistent way. The Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic is in large part the biggest generator of Dominicans immigrating to New York and other parts of the Northeast. The same thing happened with Cuba, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile. And when we talk about immigrants to the United States, we cannot ever forget that often it was the involvement, nasty, of the American government, of the US government, in coups, in sponsoring dictators that created the conditions for masses to move out and into the United States. And that's why when we talk about the caravans coming from El Salvador or from Honduras to the United States, the answer is not to put a wall between the two, between this country and Mexico. The answer is to create the conditions to help foster the conditions in Central America that will make people stay at home instead of running away. And if the American government has been a force of destruction, the American government can be also a force of construction and of the empathy. So there are various moments in the book where you see this as a direct link. Let's not think of the Bracero program, Mexicans coming to the United States in the 1920s and 30s as out of nowhere. The Mexican Revolution had a big role to play, and the Mexicans were running away from that. And also during the Second World War, the arrival of Mexicans had much to do with the fact that many Americans were in the front fighting, and there needed to be labor to work in factories and other jobs in creating weapons that allowed Mexicans to come on a temporary basis to the United States. Those histories, the history of what happens south and what happens north, are intricately, to a minute degree connected. And that's why really I don't think that you can do a Latino history without paying full attention to what has been happening in the South. And that creates also the sense, for instance, that there are chain migrations. The case of Mexicans coming from Puebla, a city in Mexico, that can come for 6 months to the United States and then go back to Mexico. We can think of it as they came for 6 months and then they return, but let's think of it more diasporically, more globally. By going back to Mexico, they also transform Mexico. They transform the language, they transform the economy, they transform the ways of relating to one another. So is that not also Latino history, what some temporary immigrants do when they go back home? I am convinced that it is.
I would agree, but I'm a little biased here. Because I think people with migration, with immigration, they often think of it, we think of it as one directional.
Right. Yeah.
People move one way, one place changes, and it's a very fluid exchange even before this particular moment in terms of our technology and the ease of movement that, yes, is unparalleled in massive changes in a short period of time, but for hundreds of years have been the daily life for many, many, many cross-border communities.
Yes, yes.
I also wanted to ask you about this interplay throughout the book, because you do have little vignettes or appearances. You have your characters, but you have appearances by lots of famous figures in United States history, in Latin American history. And when I first read it, my initial response was, okay, this is a survey, so we're focusing a lot on, major historical figures. And this is a little bit different from some of those stories I'm familiar with, because here at the museum, our focus is on ordinary people and telling stories through their eyes. But then the more I sat with it, there are folks who also pop up, maybe not a historic individual, but it's like these individuals in the bottom right of your screen, right? Just having their brief moment, their commentary on events. And it was a lot more of an exchange than I thought. So I wanted to ask you about how you chose these moments of a character popping up, whether it's Bolivar or whether it's someone who's supposed to be a bracero.
Yeah.
Just to have and often it's them commenting on the narrative, or they're commenting on something the other characters say. So how did you choose who is speaking back to that narrative?
Your question, Liz, goes really to the heart of how I conceived this project and what I wanted to achieve. In history, whom does it belong to? Who's in charge? Whose history are we telling? Who are we leaving out of this history? This is a question that we as a nation right now are very much concerned. To what extent American history has bypassed entire groups that have been silenced or marginalized or otherwise simply not mentioned in any way. And I came of age in that big question in Mexico of, is Mexican history the history of the heroes, or is it the history of the people? And if it's the history of the people, how do you tell that history? What are the instruments that a historian has to tell the story of the homemakers or of the plumbers or of the carpenters or of the students and the teachers and so on? And I was reading Eduardo Galeano, who was trying to give a different version of Latin American history. And I was always also reading the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, that wanted to really use day-to-day material culture artifacts, but mainly letters and correspondence of other forms and menus to tell the story. I wanted in this to find a balance. I wanted to have the history that is often presented in textbooks, but question that history by the so-called people themselves, that the ones that truly make the history. I wanted it to be a question mark. I didn't want it to be a statement. I didn't want the book, maybe I think that's why it touches people. I didn't want to give answers. I wanted people to be asking, really, did Bolivar do that much good for us? Did he not also become a destructive figure? Are we only the baseball players that they enter a new team, the first Black or Dominican or Puerto Rican? What about the people on the street? What do they say? In the whole book, because it's in the form of cartoons and popular culture, wants to be playing with those questions of who is in, who is left out, how do we interrogate all this, and in to what degree the history that we're presenting today will be absolutely revised in 5 years or 10 years by a new generation that will have other concerns, other views, and will have its time under the sun to show them, to present them.
Then I have to ask you about one of these big questions that you raised that struck me going through the book. You spend toward the end of the book a lot of time talking about the civil rights movements in the 1960s. And toward the end of what I think was the original version of the book, several of your characters are together on a late night TV show, debating, were these movements successful? What does it mean for them to be successful? I'm curious, before we even ask if something is successful, why is this a question you're raising? Why is a way to originally wrap up the book? Why is this the big point of debate?
I think that it's a crucial question. This was the American, with all the challenges that we have today connected with the aftermath still of slavery and Reconstruction. How do we measure the success of the American Civil War? With all the challenges that we have today with police brutality, institutionalized racism, how do we measure the impact of the civil rights movement? Did it transform America to the extent that we thought it did? Was the death of George Floyd a reminder that maybe many of those objectives had been left open and unfinished? In the case of Latinos, I have no reservation in saying that the 60s were a moment of upheaval that did not achieve its goals. I think that when I compare it to the history of Blacks in the United States, there has been it's a very complicated history, but there has been much more of an incorporation of Black history into American history. I don't think that Chicano history is part of American history yet. Mexican American history is part of it. And I think, frankly, in this woke moment that we are, there is a lot of goodwill for other groups, but there is really little interest in other groups other than the monochromatic Black and white. I think very few people know who Cesar Chavez is. Very few people know who Dolores Huerta is. There he is. And if they do, it's the name of a high school or an avenue or a highway, depending on the place in the United States. But go ask, as I do, young people if they know who Cesar Chavez is, and then they will tell you, sure, he's a boxer. They have there's no sense, and it's easy to blame young people. It's foolish to blame young people. The fact is, the legacy of Cesar Chavez remains to be digested by Latinos. Many Latinos do not feel a connection with Cesar Chavez, and by non-Latinos in this country who do not know who Cesar Chavez is, what he fought for, the farm workers' union struggles, against the pesticides, against the abusive labor laws. I don't think that the Chicano movement that was so important, the brown berets that were connected with Puerto Ricans in the mainland in the late 60s and 70s have made the kind of imprint on the American psyche that is truly of the size that we thought it would be. And you see that in a number of different ways. That those limitations, I think there's still an enormously long road to go for Latinos to be part of the middle class, but without the amnesia that often comes with the entrance to that level of commodification.
So then, to work toward a long-term success for the 1960s, for the civil rights movements of the past century, what is it that a person watching this talk or reading your book or working in a history museum needs to do? What's you talked about how you feel like the wokeness of the current moment is pretty limited. Where do things need to go?
Look, we are at a crossroads as a nation between the homogenized past and a diverse future. It's a stretch that is being very difficult to go through. Lots of tensions manifest themselves in numerous ways, tragic and subtle. And my impression is that the true concept of a plural, diverse America is still a distant dream. It's a dream worth fighting for. It's a dream that institutions have to be instrumental in bringing us closer to. But in the end, it's not the institutions only. In the end, is the comfort that the people, all of us, 335 million people, need to have with accepting that history is about all sorts of different things other than the kind of narrow view that we have had. What needs to be accomplished? We need to keep on pushing, Liz. I am an immigrant from Mexico. I've been here already longer than I lived in Mexico. This is a very generous country. It's a very complicated country. It's a country that is ready to ask questions, but it's also ready to throw them under the rug and thinking that it's enough to ask the questions, but you don't have to go any farther. There's a lot that needs to happen in the classroom, but the classroom now is a place of fear where certain things cannot be said because both the right and the left will turn you into an evil character. It's very difficult to teach right now. Very difficult. There's a lot of minds on the field that both the students and the faculty wonder if it's worth exploring and exploding. It's a difficult stretch. I think that what happened with 2 summers ago with the tragic death of George Floyd really connected us with the upheaval of the civil rights movement, but not with the upheaval of the Chicano movement and of the brown berets. I don't think that right now there's a big effort by institutions and others to think of Latinos as full members of America. I think it's a sidekick. It's a little joke. We are there, even though this is the larger minority. What needs to happen? I think the climate needs to change. I think we have to grow up. We're still a very young nation. We have to grow up. And growing up, how does it happen? By making mistakes, by asking questions, and by taking risks.
And to bring it full circle with your last question in the book, so we need to, who are not paying attention to this history, they need to, what do you learn from history?
I think that the question is, what is history? And history is the story that we tell ourselves, the convenient story that we tell ourselves, or the inconvenient story, depending on how adventurous we are. I think that history is not the past, but how we package the past, how historians package the past, and others as well. And the past, it's often thought that the future is open. I think the future is much harder to change than the past. The past is very stubborn, wants to be told in particular ways. What do we learn from history? We learn that we are changing creatures. Depending on how we position ourselves, we have certain loyalties or conveniences. And what is national history? National history is a series of conversations that are ongoing, that invite constant revision, and that are for that reason never ending. No sooner does one generation tell the story that the next generation comes and wants to offer a different perspective of that story. And the lessons that we all learn are keep on changing. That's one of the things that I wanted in this book. That's also one of the things that I see when I go to the beautiful museum that you work in. It's the history of the people. Each of these individuals was complex. Some of them were good people, some of them were not so good people. That happens to all of us. But the history of those places is the history of all of them. The way the history of the country is the history of every aspect of us.
This has been such a rich and delightful conversation, and we are just out of time, and I would love to follow that up. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I hope you're watching. We'll pick up the book. We'll link to it in the comments below. Very much appreciate your time as always, and I hope we have you back here soon.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Your questions are always wonderful, and your vision as a historian and as a person who understands very much the minute and the macro is very stimulating. Thank you for participating in this.
Thank you.